Welcome back. Because Robert keeps commenting on the pace that would take us to finish us at the rate that we're going, we're going to try to learn a little Gemara tonight, and together with the rest of our discussion, to actually break into that part of the tractate. Until now, we've been talking about the first Mishnah in Brochos. We talked about the statement about when Kriyas Shema begins and when Kriyas Shema ends, and we talked about the fact at some length that there was a whole discussion and debate in the Rishonim as to how does it work out that the shuls daven Kriyas Shema, daven Ma'ariv early, and they recite Kriyas Shema then as well. How does that work, considering that the Mishnah seems to be telling us that we can only recite Shema from Tzeisach Kochavim on? So we went through various positions in the Rishonim, and went through the whole story with Rashi and the Tosfos, and some of the discussions about that and how to understand the different views of Tosfos. So to try to break into the Gemara a little bit, just another comment just on the end of the Mishnah, just for a few minutes. So the Mishnah had told us that in terms of when Kriyas Shema ends, so there were three opinions. The opinion of Rabbi Lezer that we follow, that we only go up until the first Ashmora. Ashmora is either a third of the night or a quarter of the night. That opinion we do not follow, although there's a logic to it because it would parallel then Kriyas Shema during the daytime. And the other two opinions the Mishnah already conveys are essentially the same view. That the opinion of Rabbi Gamliel that Kriyas Shema goes all night, and the opinion of Chachamim that it should be stopped at Chatzos. And we discussed a little bit a question of whether or not that Gezerah is actually practiced. Do we assume that there really is a Gezerah of Chatzos? Is that halacha l'maisa? Or is that not the case? Is that opinion not followed? So that was a debate in the Rishonim. We mentioned last time or the time before that the practical relevance of whether or not there is a Gezerah is very slim. Because basically it works out that either way we're going to do the same thing. That we're going to try to say Kriyas Shema before Chatzos. We certainly recommend that we say Kriyas Shema before Chatzos in case there might be a Gezerah, or in deference to that possibility. So in practice you're going to try to do that. And if it happens to be that it's after Chatzos, so then you have nothing to lose by saying Kriyas Shema. Because first of all, Kriyas Shema you can always say because it's just Psukim and Chumash. It's a question whether or not you fulfill your obligation. But you certainly can always recite the words of Kriyas Shema at any time, so you have nothing to lose. And even beyond that, it's probably more than you have nothing to lose, but most would assume that the mitzvah Minat Torah is presumably applicable, that maybe you didn't manage to fulfill the Gezerah of doing it before Chatzos, but since these two opinions both agree that in Minat Torah there is a mitzvah of Kriyas Shema all night, so it's probably even better than just saying Psukim. We probably are in fulfillment of the mitzvah Minat Torah. So the one possible angle not that way was Rabbi Yonah, who Rabbi Yonah had interpreted the view that there was a Gezerah, the view of the Chachamim, as meaning they removed the mitzvah. The mitzvah didn't exist at all after Chatzos, and that's a challenging view. We mentioned that Shag Saryeh and Moshe Feinstein and others took issue with this, but it doesn't really also have so much effect because nobody in the world held this view, because Rabbi Yonah held it within the view of Chachamim, but he himself didn't paskin like Chachamim. He paskin like Rabbi Gamliel, so he held there's no Gezerah, but if there was a Gezerah, that's what it would mean. So in the Rambam, essentially the Rambam is pretty fairish that you can recite Kriyas Shema after Chatzos. And that's of specific interest because it's different than the din by Hektor Chalav and Ve'evar. There's a little bit of an awkward flow here. The Mishnah reads a little bit awkwardly if you follow Rashi's view. Because when Gamliel, when he states his view that you can say Kriyas Shema really all night, just Chazal made a Gezerah, so he says, look back in the Mishnah for a second, he says, Lozu bilvad amru, ela kol ma she'amru chachamim ar chatzos, mitzvasan ad she'yahu l'ramad hashachar. That whatever chachamim said, you can only do until chatzos. Really the mitzvah is up until the morning, up until the sunlight comes up. And then he goes on to say, the Mishnah goes on to say, Hektor chalav and ve'evarim mitzvasan ad she'yahu l'ramad hashachar. The burning of the fast of the limbs, that mitzvah is up until Amud HaShachar. We call Nachal U'Yam mitzvah Shel Amud HaShachar. And whoever has eaten in one day goes until the next morning. So Im Kein Lam Amud Chacham Chatzos Kedei L'Harchik Adam Min Averos. So then why did Chazal talk about Chatzos? Because they were trying to stop you from doing an Averos. They don't want you, and the Averis here is really a bit blasé, of neglecting to say Kriya Shema. We're afraid that if you're going to be too relaxed about the whole thing, so you're going to neglect to say Kriya Shema, so we want to avoid that situation. So if you read the Mishnah without any Rishonim, so it sounds like this is all one grouping. That by Kriya Shema and Hekter Chalavim Ve'evarim, all of these things is a mitzvah all night, and Chazal made a Gzeira up until Chatzos. But if you look at Rashi...
So only those two, or other mitzvahs also?
So,
mitzvahs of Pesach.
Right, so when the Pesach after Atonement, you know, there was essentially also a whole discussion, so that's a little bit of a separate topic.
Is that part of this?
Probably not. That's related to something else, although the base of Levi has a whole truth discussing how exactly they tie in. But it may not even be these two, because if you look at Rashi, for example, so... If you look at the second Rashi, and the last Rashi in the Mishnah, so it says, if you look at the end of that Rashi, so Rashi says, V'hekta chalavim diksani hacha, lo amru chachamim ad chatzos klal. There is no gezeira when it comes to hekta chalavim ve'evar. That's just kind of mentioned there as something that's all night, but there's no gezeira in that case. That's just there to make the point that a mitzvah halayla goes all night. But it's not an example. It doesn't share the same category with Kriya Shema that there is a gezeira until chatzos. It's very surprising. If you read the Mishnah, you don't get that impression at all. Right? You read the Mishnah, you get the impression that these are all examples of things where you could go all night, but the rabbis say until chatzos. So Rashi says, nope, it's only true about Kriya Shema. It's a very lonely category. It's all by itself. And Hekter Chalavim Ve'evarim was only mentioned because it happens all night. So the Rambam reads the Mishnah the way we would read it. The Rambam reads it the way you would probably think, that there is a Gezerah that you can only do Hekter Chalavim Ve'evarim until Chatzos. Against Rashi, Lubavitch Rebbe in his Kedushim al Shas, they printed 3 volumes of the Kedushim of Lubavitch Rebbe on Masechtas. So I think in the first piece of the first volume, he talks about this issue. He talks about this Machlokas, Rashi, and the Rambam, where they're fighting about whether or not there is such a Gezerah. But it's interesting to note, so in this case, the Rambam says it's a Gezerah, you can't do it after Chatzos. And in terms of Kriya Shema, he says you can't do it after Chatzos. So whether or not there's a Gezerah, at least you can fulfill the mitzvah after Chatzos. And in this case, the Gezerah means you cannot do it. Not that you're not guilty or something, but you're not allowed to do it. So there's a whole discussion about this in the Sefer Avi Ezri. It's written by Rav Shach Panovich. So there is an essay that's not written by him in the Sefer Avi Ezri. It's written by his son-in-law, Meir Tzvi Bergman. Also has a Sefer on Chumash called the Shari Ora. But in the Sefer on the Rambam, so he explains that in general, so as he mentioned, there's a question when the rabbis redefine mitzvos, when they tell us that you have to bench with 4 brachos, so you have to make kiddush alakos. So does that mean that if you don't follow the rules, if you make kiddush without a cup, or if you bench a shorter version, which is a mitzvah minat Torah, so do you at least fulfill the mitzvah minat Torah without filling the rabbinical details? Or do we say, no, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah at all? We've talked about this on Friday nights a couple of times. So he assumes that in general the Rambam's shita would be that as far as mitzvahs are concerned, if you don't follow the details that Chazal impose onto a mitzvah minat Torah, so you are still, you don't say mitzvah minat Torah. It's only when there's a concern of some type of prohibition. So then the rabbis have to make a absolute gezerah that the mitzvah is not there at all. So there's a difference between the burning of the fats in the limbs and Kriya Shema, because there is a biblical prohibition to let the remnants of the korban remain the next day. It's called nosar. So normally minat Torah that would go up until the day starts, and apparently there's a gzeira, at least according to the Rambam, that it should stop even earlier. It should stop at chatzos. So there, since we're afraid of an isser, we're afraid of a biblical prohibition of nosar, of leaving it over. So then they had to take a more aggressive stand. They have to say, no, after chatzos it's over. But when it comes to Kriya Shema is a positive mitzvah. So we don't run any risk of violating any isurim. We just run a risk of not fulfilling this mitzvah properly. So then presumably, even if we don't live up to what the rabbis asked of us, we're still able to fulfill the mitzvah, and we're still able to continue reciting Kriya Shema even after chatzos. Okay, so that's in terms of the Mishnah. So now, with some drum roll, let's actually look at the Gemara. So now the first Gemara in Shas, having done the first Mishnah in Shas. So the Gemara wants to know a very basic question: what are our assumptions here? why are we talking about this subject? Where does this whole mitzvah come from? So it's a very basic, fundamental question. So we'll start with the Gemara. Tana mehecha kai. Where is our Tana starting from? Where is he getting his basis from to start asking questions? What's he standing on, essentially? Diksani mei masai. Why is he asking mei masai? What mitzvah is he talking about? How does he know that there is a mitzvah to discuss? The two, my shna the tani ba'arvis bereisha. Listening to Shachris bereisha. Why does he talk about night first? Doesn't the night follow the day? So all of us who are Jewish and observe Shabbos and other such days, so we're already familiar with the fact that it doesn't exactly work out that way, but it has to be the first time that we're taught that. So here the Gemara in the opening daf of Shas tells us a little bit what that's based on. So the first question is, why are we assuming that there is a mitzvah here to start asking the details about? And once we're asking the details about Kriya Shema, let's talk about the morning Kriya Shema first. Why are we talking about the nighttime Kriya Shema before the daytime Kriya Shema? So the Gemara gives a terrific answer. Tana akrakai. The Tana, the Mishnah is based on Psukim, is based on the Torah. Because what does the Torah say? Dichsev v'shachbecha uvekumecha. Because the Torah says that we should recite Kriya Shema, that we should talk about these words when we lie down and when we get up, as we discussed in some detail when we talked about the mitzvah of Kriya Shema in general. So since there is such a mitzvah, so therefore the Gemara wants to know, the Mishnah wants to know what exactly are its parameters. So v'hachik sani, here's how we should be reading the Mishnah. Zman Kriya Shema dishchiva emas. So the time of Kriya Shema that is associated with shchiva, that's associated with lying down, emas, when does it apply? Misha shehakohanim nichnasim v'achal b'trumasan. From the time that the Kohanim go in to eat their truma. That's how we should read the fleshed out version of the Mishnah. So first of all, that first answer really answers both questions. It tells us there's an obligation of Kriya Shema, that's the pasuk which identifies it. And it's also in that sequence. Shchiva comes before Kima, the nighttime before the daytime. So we can understand why the second question is answered as well. But in terms of that second question, so the Gemara says there's another indication we could use from earlier. That if you want, we could learn it from the creation of the world. If the Torah is not ancient enough for you, so we can go to the creation of the world, even though the Torah is more ancient than the creation of the world, 2,000 years earlier. But in any event, we have an old source from the creation of the world, that there the Torah says that we have the evening, we have the morning, that's the first day. So this is the source for the idea that we have in Judaism that the day starts at night. And we'll discuss a little bit, it's really not for all intents and purposes, but for many intents and purposes, certainly Yantif and the like, so we start at the nighttime. The Beis Halevi and a few others have an observation here that maybe we could say a different reason, that we could say that this is essentially the first mitzvah that a person performs. That you become obligated to mitzvahs on your bar mitzvah. So then let's say you become bar mitzvah on the 15th of Cheshvan, so the 15th of Cheshvan starts at night, so essentially the first mitzvah you're going to have is the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. So maybe that's a good reason for the whole Masechta to start with what it starts with, the top topic we talked about during our first year. And maybe that's also why we should talk about the nighttime first. See, as a whole discussion whether or not that's really accurate. The idea that we assume that you become obligated in mitzvahs on your 13th birthday, the truth is that's really an idea of midrabanan. That in the HaTorah you become obligated in mitzvahs when you physically mature. There's a concept called chazaka d'Rabba that we assume that happens when you turn 13. So we cut it off at that point. We assume, really for purposes of Dinim d'Rabbanan for the most part, that that's when you become an adult. And you don't even think about it so much, but it happens to be that most of the things the bar mitzvah boy does, his bar mitzvah are all Rabbanans, laning and davening for the Yom, these are all mitzvahs Rabbanan. So whether that's really true, that mitzvahs really start at that exact moment, it's level when Torah is probably not true, but that's a discussion whether or not that might be a good reason to start from that point as well.
What's the connection between Vayar, Vayivoker to Shema?
So apparently that's the way a day works. That's the way. So B'Shabcha of Kamecha itself is and it addresses both components. But then when the Gemara invokes Vayar, Vayivoker, so at least it shows that's the way a day works. The day you start with nighttime. So if we're talking about night and day, let's
So
talk about
whenever,
night
so
and
then,
day.
so according to that idea, whenever you teach something that has both the day and night component to it, you would always teach the
Yeah, maybe.
night first.
Maybe, each one was gonna have its own reasons and quirks, but maybe.